Tim did such a good job. Did you work on some of the engineering about too, or the GIS together? Okay. Thank you. I love that. I wanted to do it. Yeah. Yeah, it's like well, I mean, I think that's something to take back home. Oh, do you? Yeah. Oh. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, and Haith is eliminated. That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. I'm working on the stormwater management plan to meet their MS4 requirements right now. So the work is continuing there, but I still shift to focus because they're not permit compliant at all right now. You haven't heard it. No, no. Well, that's right now. It's location apparently. The hotel. Yeah. No, not conference. Sorry. Like, no, they didn't follow up again. So I don't know. They have. Well, I do think that the Monterey Lodge issue is taking up a lot of bandwidth because that's not illegal. And residents are really trying to fight for redevelopment. So I bet that's taking a lot of the energy and focus. I know it's taking scouts. Apparently people Oh yeah. That's all you get your backpack on there. Sit like someone else. Not on here.
So it is time for us to get started. Hopefully some more folks will come back in. I'm pleased to give you all the reward of waiting around so we could have two of our great speakers coming up. This is Jake McLean, and he's going to talk a little bit more about that Southside Community Project.
My glasses on so I can see y'all. The few of you that are left are all in the back, so thanks for sticking around, and happy to share with you guys a little more in-depth look at the Southside Community Improvement Project. I think what I want to do is tell you the story of how this this project began as the Erskine Stormwater Project or Stream and Wetland Project and became the Southside Community Improvement Project, because I think that's the special story here is that journey. And as part of my presentation, I'm going to revisit the project goals that Renee had included in her presentation and talk about the evolution of the project approach, because I think that it's kind of, in the end, the most interesting part is how this came to fruition, and tell you a little bit about the ongoing design and implementation of the project. So these are the goals. As Renee said, these goals permeated throughout the watershed planning process. And in thinking about this presentation, I was thinking about these goals and trying to tell you a little bit more about how we are trying to address those goals. And I think you'll see some of that throughout the presentation with regards to the water quality and community needs. And I definitely saw in the presentation about Walnut Creek yesterday, some of their findings about how they were able to have success with the community, that we're finding a lot of the same things to be true, trying to be adaptable with our methods and with our thoughts about what's possible and what we should be doing out there, and to be listeners and to be present in different settings in the community, whether that's an event that we're not putting on, but we showed up, and that's really provided a lot of opportunity for some organic relationship development that I think's really furthered our project along. So the Southside is a historically African-American neighborhood that's just east of the French Broad River. A lot of y'all probably be familiar with the adjacent areas that the Southside kind of feels like is crowding them a little bit, which is the River Arts District and the South Slope. And those are places where, there's a lot of development for tourism. And the Southside name is really important to the community there. And they approached us early on about renaming our project as the Southside Community Stormwater Improvement Project. And that's a way for them to help promote and preserve the culture of their neighborhood. And we were happy to do that. And I think it's been a nice thing to be able to do that and really give the opportunity to the community to kind of adopt that project as their own through name as well as through the other components of the project. We've had some great community leaders, a fellow named Roy. We have a conference call with him every couple weeks, and he provides us inspirational stories about what birds and plants and what he saw last time it rained. And so I think having those folks from the community that are invested in the project have been a real benefit as well. So the evolution of this project started during the watershed planning phase. That's the Central Ash Watershed Plan, which identified the Erskine Apartments as a great opportunity for both environmental and social benefits. We rented e-bikes and rode around the watershed one day from which is a great thing to do if you go to Asheville. The flying bike, that's where we got the e-bikes from, and they're in the watershed. And this property is entirely owned by the Asheville Housing Authority. And so not only did we see some benefits for the community, but also for the landowner, which those of you involved in making projects happen know that, it helps to be able to put something in front of the landowner that benefits them on their other fronts. And so this housing development was built in around 1969. A lot of the original infrastructure is still in place, and addressing some of the infrastructure concerns as well as some of the resident concerns were things that benefit the housing authority. So it was the vision of Marshall and Renee, I think, that led us through what's been a really effective stepwise process on this project. And after being initially identified in the watershed plan as kind of a simple concept of here we've got this wetland leaking onto the street and causing health and safety issues, and we've got these concrete ditches and things that are cracking and falling apart. Marshall's recommendation for us to go forward with the basis of design report provided a really good transition phase, which I've often seen lacking from projects, that helped take this project from just an idea to something that we could go pursue grant funding for. And on a parallel track, Renee was able to do a bunch of community outreach during that basis of design report process, which culminated with a rendering from a landscape architect that we had on our team for that purpose, and which kind of set the stage for us to go forward with these grant applications and the design and implementation process. So during the watershed study and also during our design process, we've been looking at existing conditions. So I was going to share some of those with you, just to give you a little more background on the project. At the top of the project, that's AB Tech, the big parking lot there, their Ferguson Center. It's about 5 acres treated by underground detention. Then you've got that goes into the, well, some of that goes into the 15-acre watershed that's feeding the proposed regenerative stormwater conveyance. And then that other 12.5-acre watershed comes in at the bottom of the Erskine Apartments site in an area where 2 natural valleys come together. And that's where the wetland was located that was leaking onto the street. So here's some plans we were able to track down, as-built plans for the work high up in the watershed to better understand the treatment higher in the watershed. The Housing Authority was able to provide the 1968 drawings, which had some interesting information, including a bunch of very relevant utility information that is consistent with what we've been finding out there, and some existing conditions, the mapping of the original topography and vegetation on the site. So there's some good information to be had out there when you're looking into projects like this. And this is a photograph from aerial photographs from about the same place between 1963 and 1978, the time frame during which a lot of the urban renewal projects happened in this area. You know, that was road widening. You can see the density of residential development and business, and part of that development that existed prior to the urban renewal was a lot of cottage industry and businesses. People would come into the depot down on Depot Street in the Glen Rock area, and then they would spread out into this business district where there was jazz clubs and other places. And there's over 300 businesses that were demolished as part of this urban renewal process. And so that had a huge impact on this community. And I think we're kind of excited to be able to try to do something positive with this project. So a lot of the existing infrastructure, as I mentioned, is still in place. So it's been about 50 years now that these concrete channels and pipes have been in place. And we got the city to agree to do some camera work on these lines. They surveyed all the pipes here shown in blue. As probably one would expect, those turned up a lot of broken pipes that were rusting, blind junction boxes that may kind of make our job a little harder to figure out what's at what elevation. And so we're moving forward with that information, as well as these other existing conditions. There's a lot of on-street parking and a lot of parking in general. So car fluids and other things of that nature are concerned for water quality. You've got these headwater drainages that have been converted to concrete channels. And so the idea of trying to renaturalize those channels and also address the fact that that infrastructure is deteriorating and will need to be replaced. And then in the lower part of this picture, you can see the existing natural wetland. This is the one that was oozing onto the street, and it's also overgrown with invasive species. There's some major trash problems on the site, which is slightly more difficult and a challenge in and of its own. But the other social opportunities that we identified at the site were aesthetic opportunities, such as removing this fence, which no longer serves its original purpose. We saw a ton of common use trails that we felt like providing folks a way to get from point A to point B on a more constructed trail system would be a wonderful thing for the community, connecting them up to their community center up on the road with some staircases and trails. And we found some overhead power lines that probably most of us would be appalled if this was in our backyard and had where our kids were playing was a 7-foot tall power line running through there. So we're looking to relocate and raise that. And, we also heard some input from the community about the importance of this green space here in the lower right. And that was us when we set up the Asheville on Bikes, set up a nice mobile bike park, which is a really cool thing. Had bike jumps, and they brought some bikes out there and the kids rode around on those. And, this open play area was an area that, initially we thought, well, this is a great spot to put a stormwater feature, but, it's also a really important feature for the community. And so that was some of the feedback we heard back. So these were the two concepts, as Renee showed, the original concepts of replacing the concrete ditch with the regenerative stormwater conveyance and addressing these issues down at the wetland. And as part of the vision for the project, we were able to incorporate a lot of these features and kind of integrate them into this linear regenerative stormwater conveyance corridor through these trail projects. And there you see the wetland down at the bottom of the screen. Up on Livingston Street, that's the community center across the way. And you can see we're trying to connect these trails into the existing sidewalks that go up to the buildings. We're also looking for opportunities to disconnect these buildings through DIS practices to smaller rain gardens and bioretention basins. And then, the RSC, that's more of a kind of dealing with the regionalized 15-acre watershed runoff, whereas the DIS projects are dealing with that localized runoff from small parking lots and buildings. Some of the community input that we got, there was, it surprised me a little bit at first, but it makes a lot of sense that an interest in, who's going to maintain these long-term, some kind of recognition that, people come into the neighborhood and do things, and there's not a great plan of how to make these things last, particularly, also that relates back to the original design and what are we building these out of, and how robust and I guess resilient are the implementation features. Desire for a memorial space. Renee went through a lot of these, so I'll kind of breeze through these, but we heard a lot of great information about some of the concerns, but also some of the interests that folks had with the space that we were developing, and that set us up to be able to pursue funding with the support of the community for these projects. So we're currently working on the design phase of this project and planning to bid the project in about a month. I've mentioned a lot of the existing conditions work we did. We also looked at hydrologic evaluation of the flows coming out of these watersheds. We put a pressure transducer in the wetland just to kind of try to validate what the rainfall runoff relationships that we saw coming through that wetland feature. And we've had Wildlands has an adaptive management team that we do a lot of mitigation projects where we keep up with them for 7 years and do vegetation management and things of that nature. And they've looked at this project and given us some advice about some pre-construction treatment of vegetation and also long-term management of invasives. We did the kind of the typical jurisdictional things required for permitting, and this is our list of site features that we're implementing. I think Renee's talked about some of these, the shade sail and Memorial Plaza. Those were amenities that were desired by the community. We're also installing a French drain down where there'd been some digging around down there by the wetland area to try to address the safety issues on the street. And that's been partially effective, but water still seeps out of that pavement. And so part of that is trying to address that, one of those initial issues that brought us to the site, which was the aesthetic and safety issues and the smell of all that water seeping out onto the pavement. So these were character images that we provided along with the concept rendering to the community to give them a better visualization of the things that we had proposed stormwater wise and the things we had heard from them amenity wise. We're pursuing a nationwide 27 restoration permit for the wetland work. We're going to be doing some recontouring in there and making that provide some stormwater benefits as well. And the way that they're able to permit that work is because of the existing condition being so deteriorated. It's got sedimentation, invasive species. And so by being able to show a functional uplift in that wetland, we're also able to integrate some stormwater benefits into that. That's probably kind of an atypical situation, but something that may come up in urban settings more often than in like a more natural setting or a less disturbed setting. We've had a number of ongoing discussions with Green Opportunities, which is a green jobs training outfit that's right across the street from this project. And are trying to figure out the ins and outs of how to integrate them into different components of the project. Getting these trainees between 16 and 24 years old out on a construction site, working on implementing trails, erosion control, stormwater features, learning some about surveying. And so we're trying to figure out how to make this a valuable opportunity to them so they can, go off and be work in this sector of stormwater management if they take a passion for that. We've had a lot of great partners, not listed on this, but very significantly the Residents Council of the Housing Authority, as well as Roy, that's been a champion for the project. And I think that's a critical thing for projects of this nature, is to have those community members that just take a personal interest and are champions of that. I think some of the things that, we're working on that we feel like will be challenges, but ones that we're up to are bidding the project. And I think the challenge of how to integrate the job training opportunities into, under the purview of a contractor or under the purview of, for quite a while, we're trying to set this up to be, to have someone to specifically be a liaison between the contractor and the job trainees. And that person's moving to Colorado, but we're working on a new solution for that. But I think that's something that we're working towards, how to, what are the things that we need to do to make this happen and come to fruition. Also, given the setting, some of the sequencing and safety planning and how to deal with, the gas lines that are running here, there, and everywhere, and all the other utilities in the complex are all challenges that, hopefully next year I'll come tell you how we figured those all out. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Jake. We're going to move right on to the next presenter, but there'll be an ample opportunity to ask Jake and all the presenters questions from previous session and this one. Our next presenter is Mary Roderick with Land to Sky Council of Governments, and she's going to talk about what we have begun to call preserving and restoring a gem.
Yes. So thank y'all for sticking with us. I know it is the end of the day, but this is a really cool project too. And it's a component of this much larger, watershed planning process that you've been hearing about. Luckily, Renee did get that creek named, right, through that process, because now we can call, this is the project, the Haith Branch Watershed. Otherwise, it would be the unnamed stream. So we did this work, and I'll just continue through the Greening America's Communities program. That is something through the EPA. It started out as something in the state capitals. They expanded it to all communities. And they have worked with 39 communities in the last 10 years. So that was through 2020. We're not in that number. So they've worked with a few more. And what they do is provide green infrastructure design assistance. And we were selected for that program because of our participation in another program called Building Blocks for Regional Resilience. And I'm mentioning all that in case someone in your community wants to look into these programs, because you automatically get selected for the Greening America's Communities program if you do Building Blocks to Regional Resilience. So check those out. I'm not going to go talk more about them right now, but that was what brought that design assistance to our region. And then, we selected the Central Ash Watershed for that design assistance. Why the Central Ash Watershed? I think you've already been hearing from so many wonderful people. My boss is calling me, about all the work that they've been doing. And I was just a stakeholder at one of the meetings Renee had invited me to. I knew it had been going on. I knew that, the EPA expected to do a planning process, and I didn't want to do a superficial process. I knew that this process had already been in place, that had been over a year long. There had been extensive community outreach. And that there were a lot of great priority projects that focused on green infrastructure in the plan. So I reached out to Renee and said, hey,
do you want to receive this design assistance? And she's like, well, yeah. Luckily. So the partners, again, I've mentioned the EPA. The EPA hired 2 firms, one actually based here in Raleigh, Biohabitats, and Spackman Mossop Michaels. They were based, the office we worked with was based in New Orleans. They worked on all 4 projects nationwide. Ideally, we would have been hiring locally, in my opinion. We have some fantastic designers and engineers in our region, but it was a great collaboration, and I think they did a really good job. We partnered with AB Tech. That's one of, Jake mentioned part of the campus that's above the Southside community. We worked on another portion of the campus. We partnered with them on these projects, and I'll talk more about what projects those were. And of course, obviously Riverlink as the leader of the watershed planning process. And our process did follow that bottom graphic, the initial design, the charretting, community feedback, revisions, and final report, even though we were doing it all remotely. I want to go into that virtual meeting structure just a little more. We kicked it off with it was a 3-day process. Normally they do it, in person, and it's very, tabletops and sticky notes and big pictures, the kind of common community kind of engagement process that if you've done this design work, you're familiar with, but we had to do it all virtually. They did come do an informal site visit. It wasn't EPA sanctioned, but they wanted to come anyway. So that's a good thing about being in Asheville, right? Kevin from Biohabitats came up, and Wes and Emily came from New Orleans. We met them out there, walked the site, and that was really good. But then we met with the key decision makers from AV Tech first, because we really wanted, I think, to get a feel for what they were willing and interested in doing, because it's on the AV Tech campus. And then we had a first public meeting that evening, and then we had theme-based meetings on the following Monday after the team did some initial revisions. And, like Jake emphasized, we were, while this was green infrastructure focused, we really wanted to look at other opportunities. So campus visioning, more ecological restoration, that was part of the green infrastructure, recreation and mobility. And I feel like I'm left off a group. I think those were split. Green infrastructure was one group and ecological restoration was another. Okay. So more revisions, and then we came back together and we presented that final set of designs to everyone, stakeholders, public, all together. But again, all via Zoom, not nearly as fun as in real life. I do think I drank a beer Friday night though, while we were doing the public meeting. I don't know if I would have done that in person. We encouraged everyone to, since it was a Friday night, we were so excited. And then when I realized what we'd scheduled, I'm like, why did we do a meeting on a Friday night? That's maybe kind of dumb. So we had, of course, AB Tech involved. The CFO was really instrumental. Renee had engaged with him through the Central Ash Watershed planning process. He got the president involved, some of the board of trustees. I put board of directors, that was wrong, board of trustees. We had grounds and maintenance because they're going to have to maintain it. Hearkening to what Jake was saying, you got to have the people involved that are going to do the real work on the ground, the stormwater engineer, of course, faculty and students. But AB Tech, Asheville, Buncombe, right? It's also shared by Buncombe County. They have responsibility for the campus. They also have a sewer line on Haith Branch. We had their stormwater and erosion sediment control people there. And we had a lot of people from City of Asheville from several departments that are all listed here. The French Broad River MPO director participated because of the mobility and greenway connectivity aspects. I invited UNC Asheville to participate. Their sustainability, they have co-directors of their sustainability office because it's also a campus. They're also doing a lot of cool things. I wanted to engage them, and community partners like Asheville Greenworks. So, we really did try to make this an inclusive and expansive process to get a lot of input. And I think that's reflected in the designs. This is from the Central Ash Watershed Plan itself. And you see the circles are a series of projects, both SCMs, the regenerative stormwater conveyance, and stream bank stabilization. So all the hard work was done by Marshall and company, and kind of working through, what are all the potential projects in the watershed. Each of them has a project summary sheet and a cost estimate. This is really fantastic, and it's a great basis, to build upon for a project like this. So the design team didn't have to do any of that work, right? They came in and did a wonderful site plan, starting out sites 1A and 1B, the purple, starting at the top of the parking lot. And that's southwest of AB Tech site that Jake mentioned. And then sites 2A and 2B and site 3. So I'm going to talk about all these briefly, mainly just to highlight their relationships and kind of the co-benefits that we were able to also integrate into the design process. So existing conditions, all pretty standard parking lots. The section 1B or site 1B is an underutilized parking lot, mainly used for storage right now. The design basically was to take a lot of parking out, put in some picnic tables because it's a commuter campus. A lot of people are eating in their cars. There's a vignette of that in a moment. The lower lot is completely removed and turned into lawn and terrace seating. So Tim is a big fan of terracing. I wish he was here. But the terracing also, serves to slow and manage stormwater. But on a campus, an amphitheater is a wonderful asset to have. So, at each time looking at how the stormwater management can also be a community amenity, in this case, the campus community amenity. So the section, I just want to show this briefly because, it's when you visualize it in section view, the current design is, runoff goes into the inlets and it's piped underneath the parking lots and does not run off into these wonderful parking area or the beds in between because they're mounded, right? And instead, really taking them out, allowing the rainwater to go in, turning those into cool picnic areas. So that was the section view for those upper sites. And that's a vignette. And I would love to see that happen. So fingers crossed. I'll talk about that in a minute. Moving on to the lower site, all that stormwater from the top is some, there's overland flow, but it's also being piped underneath. And then down to Haith Branch, and we'll see what's happening because of that. It's pretty brutal. They suggested slowing it with the terracing. There's also a weir control structure envisioned at the end, using that lawn to soak up more stormwater, another rain garden at the end. So I think a really nice change. And of course, if that became reality, it'd be way better than it was before, right? and a nice campus space. It's a commuter campus, and there's not a lot of kind of campus spaces. HCC, the community college in Haywood County, is much more campusy, and it's really wonderful. And that kept playing in my mind too, and how I wanted to get the team out there, but I think we chose to meet at New Belgium instead or something. I mean, like beer or another community college campus visit. I don't know. Anyway. So another big component of this, which I really liked, was the Riparian Area Management Plan. That was a policy recommendation. And the design team did not engage with the policy level aspect of right-of-way coordination. We did not get them into that, trying to work across city departments and the county and who's doing what, when, and where. That still needs to be done, and I think is an important part of the recommendations from the watershed planning process. What the design team did is just visualize some of the practices that were suggested. So the regenerative stormwater conveyance and the stream bank stabilization. So we're moving down from the parking lots now to the blue sites. This is where that stormwater from those parking lots is coming off into what Renee calls the erosional gully. This is a small tributary to the Haith Branch. And continuing on, you can see it really is an erosional gully. It's a big mess. And I mean, that's a lot of erosion. Kevin's there for scale. So of course, managing that stormwater on the upper parking lot is critical. And then doing the restoration work here. Biohabitats designed this regenerative stormwater conveyance, which we've talked about some. So I'm just going to continue on. I'm not going to go into the details, but I think they, as precedents, they shared some other work they've done, a very similar stream, this one in Washington, D.C., and this is 4 years later. I mean, the change is just outstanding. Right. I'm so impressed with this practice and its implementation. And, certainly that small erosional gully could use this work. So So that's the other component. And then finally, the stream bank stabilization. This is pretty standard. They added some deer to the picture, and it turns out there are deer wandering around out there. One thing that you're not seeing is a gathering space that they had also envisioned. There is a trail. There's a sign now describing the Haith branch that Riverlink has installed, but that's a classroom space too. So, how can you make that more functional for a classroom? And I hate that that section does not have that in there, but that was another component. So this was the kind of finished total plan. I did not touch on the reforestation. They did suggest that's the dark green, at least a 20% reforestation. I mean, the campus is pretty forested compared to the rest of the city, but they saw potential to add another 20% trees to reach a 60% forestry goal, because of course that's also helpful with stormwater management. But you see the Mountain View Amphitheater. Yeah, I think and the loop trail. So there's that trail, but the potential to connect that trail out to the Nasty Branch Greenway and into the communities adjacent to the campus. That was another thing that we talked about and that we were interested in doing. So from the public meetings, from the stakeholder meetings, that there was really a universal agreement around the goals of the project. People got it. They understood it. They, wanted to see that stormwater management happening. They wanted to see those amenities. They certainly want to see that restoration work being done. They were fine with removing parking, which the design team was shocked. All right, like that never happens. But AB Tech had built a giant parking structure right next to those parking lots. So those parking lots are underutilized as it is. So that was part of meeting with the campus, like the president, at the beginning, before saying, "Oh, we're going to remove all your parking," like to just make sure they're okay with promoting that idea. Don't want to make any enemies right at the beginning of a project. So they were on board with that. And people like the regenerative stormwater conveyance. They understood it and really liked the idea of connecting to the communities, because that's always, a discussion of like, are we this insular isolated thing, or are we part of the community? And the overarching resonating statement from folks on the campus was, we're part of this community. We want to invite the community in. We want to, they can use the trail system. Like, that's a good thing. And we had that feedback from community members as well, that they were interested in having that access and having that open door, right? That's just not a conversation that's happening right now. So, by really kind of strengthening that trail system and signage and saying, hey, use this, like that creates a different dynamic. The last thing was that ability to connect to the AB Tech curriculum and workforce development. And Jake, I want to talk to you about the questions y'all are having and see if we can bring in our workforce development director to think of, because we've got funding for supporting those kinds of things. I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, and the Land Sky has that whole branch of it to do that. So I think we can support. But we talked about a lot of potential with the coursework that the students are doing and how to integrate that into the project. So I think the model that you're exploring right now in the Southside community, we can also explore for AB Tech. So to summarize, we on the green things, right, or the green infrastructure, reforestation, stormwater management, and the stream restoration, RSC. But we want to, use those things to improve the health of both the watershed and the AB Tech campus and community through recreation, through educational opportunities, through social enrichment, and through community connection. So, I think the project is not yet funded. We have these wonderful designs. Renee is working on multiple grant applications. So fingers crossed that something comes into fruition soon. And the Board of Trustees were also interested in putting some money towards the project. So I think if we can find that funding, we can also come back next year and talk about our implementation. That's it for me.
Mary, thank you. So I'm going to ask all the presenters from this session and the prior to come up and sit at the table here and all. In the meantime, if you have this question, particularly for Mary, step up to a microphone and ask. But next, we're going to ask you to raise your questions of all the presentations that you've seen over the last two sessions. And if you don't do so, I'm going to start asking questions.
Tim is on here as well.
We're gonna get Tim to the table, so to speak. here.
I'm here.
There's no open questions from the online audience right now. A couple of comments, but no. Any questions for any of the presenters? Would you mind, just for our online folks, would you mind stepping to a microphone?
This is probably more of a philosophical question, but how is the naming of the streams going as far as community engagement going?
I think it's been a very successful program. We've been over the last 5-6 years averaging probably 2 naming campaigns per year. And the way we do it, we reach out initially. So we map out all of the properties that are adjacent to the stream, and we reach out to those property owners, or if it's a renter, we reach out to those folks first and ask if they have name suggestions, and then and give us a story or a reason behind the name, and we give them the guidelines that the USGS Board of Geographic Names gives us, and we get their names, and then we create an online poll, and we distribute flyers, and people have an opportunity to vote for their favorite name, and then whoever gets the most votes wins. And then we submit all of that paperwork to the USGS for consideration of it becoming the official stream name.
Yeah, because your guys' proposals for names have been the best ones that we've had that we've never. I'm on the NC Board of Geographic Names, and we make the recommendations for those.
Okay.
So, and we've seen yours, and we get other ones that says, I want to name it after my kid. You know, it's like, can we have some more information?
We get those suggestions too, but they just kind of get, shuffled aside.
Thank
But
you for that.
yeah, we had one household. I think now we say one name suggestion per household. We had one household where everyone in the house suggested a name. There were 5 family members, and it was like Hawk Branch, Bear Branch. I don't know.
We're recommending as part of the engagement component of these restoration plans is for people to go out and find the unnamed streams and do some process to get a name together. And I kind of like how you guys have been doing it. So I'm going to recommend that.
It's been working well, I would
Yeah.
say. Yeah.
Thanks.
Got a question for you, Jake, on your wetland restoration specifically and the vegetation that you are planning to use. Are you planning to do mostly like shrubs and grasses? Or are you planning to use trees as well? I was talking or listening to a presentation earlier and talking to some other people, and it seems like shrubs and grasses are the most common. So I was just kind of wondering what your plans were for the revegetation process.
Yeah. I think we're interested in kind of a mixed community. So it's similar to what there's is now. There's some canopy and there's some open. And so I think we'll end up with a comparable mix of some open areas and then some areas to just increase the diversity of habitat opportunities there, and also for the shade.
Yep. Okay, cool. Thank you.
I'll just add that during our stakeholder events, community members expressed that they wanted edible plants. And so we're going to incorporate native edibles. We're planning for pawpaw trees, hazelnut, elderberry, blueberries, maybe cranberry around the wetland. Yeah. And there's a community garden across the street behind the community center, the Southside Community Farm. And we're talking with them about doing some collaboration where maybe these edible plantings can serve kind of as an extension of their garden, and because they harvest produce from the community garden and then distribute it at a little tailgate market in the community. So we're hoping maybe this can contribute to their efforts as well.
Food forest.
Food forest.
Tim's such a big fan of food forest,
Yeah.
right?
Just want to lift you guys up for just the holistic nature of what you guys are doing with all these different projects. But this is a question for Tim. In regards to the disconnected impervious surface work you guys are doing, are you planning on the research findings, sharing those with DEQ, and maybe having that? I don't know if there is a possibility of those standards, if the data is, if they can use it to become a standard in the mountain region for doing DIS?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the question. I mean, our hope is that ultimately either it will become part of the state criteria or maybe like a design supplement for the mountains. And, everything that we do will be publishing and sharing and making it available. Anybody else, feel free to chime in because they're all also involved in the project. Renee or Marshall.
That was certainly a focus when we started out. I mean, we recognized for a long time that these low cost, very practical approaches, particularly DIS as represented in the state stormwater manual, just isn't practical in steep slope areas and so forth. So we wanted to do something that would contribute. That's the plan anyway.
And in regards to the social side of things, we are also definitely planning in our next steps to take these survey results that we found and find ways to show these results to the communities that answered these surveys so that we are transparent in the results that we found and what next steps we will take.
I don't think it was mentioned, but we're also working on a Survey 123 application that will help with the potential for landowner self-documentation of these, inspection, showing that they're still connected and working, things that would be, potential barriers to a municipality of saying, well, how are we going to prove that, if we're supporting this in some way that it's being kept up. And so we think that will have some value, and it's also going to have some value in terms of the internal monitoring that we're doing to help with data collection on the monitoring phase of the project.
Jake, I already built an app for that. So before you spend the efforts, check out what we have first.
Yeah, I mean, we have some project specific needs, I would say, but I think it would be good to maybe be able to document. Scott may have built it this week, but but I think being able to document, what we've done and what you've done, and show those as examples of how that can go towards reporting of this type of project, I think will be helpful for future.
How do we access your app?
I send you a link.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a question that was running through my mind and thinking about your presentation yesterday is how to take the story maps that y'all have built, both for Smith Mill Creek and for Central Ash Watershed, and connect them into your WAP system, because that's a fantastic resource. And I'm all on board on us getting these watershed plans into this interactive kind of statewide, but zoom into local level. And so my software brain was clicking on yesterday and like, okay, what do we have to do to kind of share data between the two systems? Because it's all the same technology. So that's something on my mind, something we could talk about. Renee's really got she's the owner of those systems. But I'm thinking about how can that be a part of the bigger WAP system. So it's a conversation we should have.
It's way easier than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. But the story map itself is awesome. I mean, in terms of people, I mean, how do you, that's a question I have. It's like how I use your story map all the time, but do you think people that you engage with in the community and the watershed planning process are comfortable or have been using that technology, or is there different levels, I guess?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah.
But what is clear is it's a way to keep the document give the cliche alive.
Right.
You know, we can update projects, we can report on the current status of the project instead of saying, oh, that's up on the shelf, I'll pull it off, and this was its status 18 months ago.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's the vision behind the WAP system too. So yeah, absolutely.
And all of that kind of segues in, audience, please, if you have a question, bring it up. But I wanted to start putting people on the spot here a little bit. And I'm going to start with Renee, you know, our fearless leader deserves
Yay.
it. Yeah. Renee made it clear to the beginning that she didn't want a plan that went up on the shelf and didn't get implemented, right? And so we talked a lot about how to build coalitions for implementation. And I guess my question, Renee, and then anybody else that wants to chime in on this, is how do you go about building those coalitions for implementation? And has this particular project taught you any lessons in that you know, of techniques or things that you didn't know before?
Well, I think the watershed planning process was crucial to building those relationships and the stakeholder groups that will ultimately help us implement the projects in the plan. We met so many community leaders and engaged residents through that process that it also allowed us to, you know, pull in staff from City of Asheville and Buncombe County. We invited grant funders to some of those stakeholder meetings and got them engaged so that they could kind of talk us through, like, well, you know, if you're going to propose these types of projects, you know, they're fundable to us or they're not fundable for us. So maybe you want to focus a little more in these areas. And yeah, I think we had a lot of success in that regard. And as we're moving into the implementation phase, you know, most of those original stakeholders are still coming to meetings. So I feel like that's a sign of success that they're still engaged in the process. You know, to what extent some of those groups like the city and the county are going to help us implement the projects is to be seen. Yeah, TBD. Lessons learned. I mean, I think Jake touched on this, this idea of, you know, how we were communicating the plan and the projects to the community. And going into this, you know, honestly, I didn't know a lot about the history of urban renewal in the marginalized communities in the watershed, and felt like I definitely kind of fumbled at times with the outreach in those communities and learned a lot along the way. I didn't mention this in my plan, or in my presentation, but we originally called this watershed restoration plan the River Arts District Watershed Restoration Plan, because the three streams ultimately drain into the River Arts District, and that's where they meet the French Broad River. That's where most people see and interact with the streams. And so at the time, it seemed like, okay, well, that's a logical way to describe the area that we're studying. But when we started doing community outreach events in the historic African-American Southside community, we heard from residents that they did not feel connected to the River Arts District whatsoever, that it was there for tourists and that not for them. And they, you know, said they were concerned that the gentrification happening there was going to expand and consume their neighborhood, and they were going to lose the identity of the Southside community. And so it really, like, it was obvious that just the name that we were presenting to the community on our maps and in our flyers was going to present a huge barrier to engaging those residents and getting that critical feedback that we needed from them. So we regrouped and talked about changing the name. I mean, it was the name that was on our grant application, our grant contract, and it's what we had been calling it, you know, in the press. But then we ultimately decided it was the best thing to do, and we decided on the Central Asheville Watershed as the name because it, you know, it better described the geography of the watershed we couldn't really name it after a single stream because we were looking at 3 streams that drained into a section of the French Broad River. And so, yeah, we rebranded the project for the better. And we also, we started out calling it Town Branch. And because that's what it's called on maps, and then discovered through those same conversations with residents that, oh, the city of Asheville renamed this creek Town Branch during urban renewal, and with no input from the residents. And they had always called it Nasty Branch, which isn't a pleasant sounding name for the stream. And we don't want it to be nasty, but it had that historical context, and it was how the residents connected to the stream. And so we decided to redo our maps and include the Nasty Branch name. And, when we're working in the community, we refer to it as Nasty Branch, and people seem to really, really appreciate us being, I guess, adaptive like that.
So geographic names, excuse us, but it was,
Yeah.
we needed to do that.
Yeah. So maybe like a lesson learned, I don't know,
That's a good one.
do your home, maybe do your homework more ahead of time, learn more about the community. I don't know. Some things I think you just have to learn along the way and fumble your way through it. But
Or maybe the lesson there is be open to learning yourself as you.
yeah,
go into it.
yeah.
Okay, I want to address Keith and Allison next a little bit. Tim touched on the fact that monitoring of this DIS project is more than just water quantity, water quality, hydrology, so forth. It's the homeowners and their neighbors' experiences and so forth. So I guess my question to you is, how do you go about assessing how attitudes, acceptance, or rejection changes when the neighborhood actually sees a project in place and has experience with it, instead of just an engineer sitting there describing it?
Do you want to take it? Okay. Well, thanks, Marshall. As you know, in the social sciences, one of the tools we use is interviews, and I know that a lot of door knocking has happened in the Central Ash Watershed, although we didn't do that yet. But we do have a plan in place, and Allison is part of that plan, to not only continue to stay in touch with the homeowners at the test sites, but the immediate neighborhood around them. And we're going to do a periodic check-in and interview service, very short kind of interview, where we can learn from how they may react differently or not even notice, or whatever it may be that is happening in their neighborhood, but ultimately draw attention to it and see how that might impact in a further assessment down the road. So it's a matter of staying in touch, and some of these things take a lot of time before they sink into our subconscious, or even into our consciousness, and that we're aware of these things. And that's only really the first step, right? And the awareness piece is only noticing and considering, and then there are the following steps that we'll be assessing about, related beyond the attitudes, and ultimately tracking behaviors, to see if new installations, more requests for help are coming from the neighborhood, and that sort of thing. Allison, sorry.
No, you're fine. So to add on to that, we don't know the exact process that we will be using yet, but we have discussed a lot the idea of, so currently the installations are just those mulch banks at the moment. And we were interested in how people's perceptions may change over time as those installations start to bloom in the spring. So we may try to choose periodic times that are based as those installations start to blossom and actually be more noticeable to the eye as an eye-catching garden versus a mulch pit, if people are engaged with the mulch, or if they're not engaged until there are those visual plants there. Or also the idea of, once there are those plants there, how long would it take someone to actually catch on to what they are?
If I can just follow up, then will what you learn in this process then be useful towards further educating the overall community about these practices and their acceptability and so forth?
I think it definitely will be because we can learn what people see these sites as and perceive them as and understand them to be. Because if people just see them and think of them as regular landscaping, then they aren't really fully understanding it. So it will help us understand what people think of when they see these sites and if it makes them think of anything beyond landscaping or how they want to be engaged and what their acceptance level is of those sites.
I'll build on that because I mean, I'm very interested and I didn't know they were really doing this work. I mean, obviously, once we were doing the session together, I did, but from the perspective of the Stormwater Partnership and the MS4 permit requirements of public education outreach and public engagement involvement, and just downright management on their own property of their stormwater. I mean, it's huge to know this information for me, from my perspective, in terms of working within each of the municipalities and talking to them about what kinds of information to put on their stormwater website, what kinds of outreach materials to send out to their residents. You know, we don't want to promote an idea that's not working, that people don't like. I think this is super cool, the DIS, but I'm really interested in their results. So like, and that's just kind of organic. Like this wasn't planned, but that's work I'm doing and I want to know what they're finding so that I can build on that when I'm working with all the jurisdictions in our region.
Great.
So that's super cool.
I'll just say something to connect it back to your first question to Renee. And you were asking about coalitions for implementation. And one of the tools in community-based social marketing deals with at least one subset, which would be the residents. And something that could be a common approach is to identify the block leader and have the block leader become part of that network in the coalition that's much broader. Of course, the coalition would also include government and NGOs and such, but that piece of neighbor to neighbor education and awareness raising will be a really critical part of this process. Not just what can we produce that they might learn from, but how do we connect those networks and build and spread these new innovations.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Tim and Jake to weigh in here. During the quote monitoring period, we have talked about and are moving towards monitoring much more than just water quality and quantity. We've talked about, looking at the maintenance issues that the property owners bring up. Did the practices serve as any impediment to their uses of their lawns and so forth? Would either of you like to kind of expand upon that? What kind of information is going to be collected that can be used in educating others? Y'all can fight over who goes first.
Yeah. So we're focusing, we've, I guess, deferred a lot of the social research more to Keith and Allison. And we've been focused more on the functionality, the water management of the practices. But it's a good point, Marshall. I think since we're still early in the monitoring process, we do need to incorporate all of the data that we want to get, including, I think that's an important question is, is this impacting your use of your yard? So I wish I had known you were going to ask this question beforehand and I would give you a better answer, but yeah, well, Jake is working on the app, so we'll have to, talk about bringing that into the app.
Jake, anything to add? No. Mary, I want to go back to AV Tech a little bit. Haith Branch, or what's now Haith Branch, has always been used, has been used for a number of years. It's kind of an outdoor laboratory setting for some of the classes there and so forth. What particular attention was brought to that, and what has been the faculty and student feedback in terms of how the restoration plans and so forth would augment that? I mean, to me, just the restorative stormwater conveyance is a wonderful opportunity for students to see that process.
Right. 100%. We had that same feedback both from faculty and staff, and one faculty who, does take her students out there regularly, was like, please fix the erosional gully. It's horrible. But they absolutely saw that as classroom and curriculum opportunity. And so I think that, Renee, in thinking about funding and timing, and please, keep me in the loop too, so that, we can do that outreach back to the faculty and bring in our workforce development and kind of educational kind of partnerships with AB Tech to make sure that we meaningfully involve the students in those processes. So I think we can practice on the Southside community, but yes, we had very positive resonance from from both the faculty and the students, and students saying, we want to learn about this stuff. We want to see it being implemented. We want to understand how this, how this works. They do have engineering students, for example. We talked about grading, right? And the lack of, actually UNCA talked about the lack of qualified grading contractors, and how, if that's not a program at AB Tech, it needs to be. So that was another thing that had come up, how the difficulty they had in implementing their RSC on their campus. And it was largely an issue with the grading contractor. I think they had to redo it twice. So that's the kind of dark side of it, but is it still novel in a way, and it's hard to find people who are skilled enough to do it, which is why connecting it to curriculum and connecting it to workforce development is so crucial.
Yeah, we do have the surveying course from maybe Tech out there surveying Haith Branch probably this
Good.
afternoon if it's not raining too hard, but they've been they helped survey the erosional gully and survey the branch, and create some opportunities to go out there and meet with them and teach them about stream geomorphology, because up to that point, they'd been surveying other kinds of stuff, but hadn't really thought about, well, if I'm going to go about surveying the stream, how's that different from other traditional surveying methods? And so I think that's a nice outcome of being able to expose them to some real world projects, and also just a different domain than your average surveyor deals with every day.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, that was really great from the onset of the project. Once the RSC or erosional gully was identified, the AB Tech surveying instructor got the class out there, said right up front, this is not the type of surveying we generally do, where they produce, topographic mapping for us. They went through, found the location, and identified all the trees with DBH diameter greater than 4 inches and that type of thing. So it gave the students a real world project that said, hey, we're documenting what's there, and then they'll move through with documenting the post-construction as built. Plus, they helped us find a lot of stormwater pipes that we didn't know.
Yeah, there's also a biology faculty member there who's had her students going down and doing macroinvertebrate surveys in Haith Branch. And so we have pre-construction data from her, and she's going to continue having her students do that once we complete the stream bank stabilization work. And there's a microbiology teacher who's going to be sampling for bacteria, using her students sampling for bacteria in the stream. So it really is a living laboratory for the campus.
And it really is a gem. I mean, we walked it and found, hill caning out there and other things,
Nice.
Natural seep areas that are important ecological niches. I have a question for both Jake and Renee, again, on the Southside project. And I guess there's two parts of it. The first is you had to be running into some places where you found it necessary to trade off a little bit between water quality treatment and community aesthetics or other desires and so forth. Is there anything that particular comes to mind there, and how you approach that trade-off? And then the second part of it is kind of related. To what degree is there continuing concern that what this project is gonna do is lead to displacement or more expense or, or some adverse impact on the community.
I think I'll let Jake talk about how the design has been kind of adapted to residents' needs and concerns, but yeah, there hasn't been, because it's a public housing, because the Housing Authority of Asheville owns the land, there's a deed restriction on it that it can only ever be affordable housing. So there isn't that concern of gentrification at this site. But I definitely have heard residents say, oh, I hope our rent doesn't go up after this. Is this going to make our rent higher? Or some of the, housing authority staff concerned about how it might take away from their budget to do other things, like replace gutters and whatnot. So yeah, definitely some concern there, but less so about gentrification.
So Jake, did you face any water quality treatment versus community aesthetics or other concerns that you had to evaluate that trade-off?
I would say that Playfield is kind of the first example that comes to mind, and that we're working with really limited space to begin with, given the topography and the utilities, and so we kind of come into it with the idea of trying to maximize treatment, and I think there is a little bit of adapting, like what we would ideally do to what fits best within the social system and the needs of the residents, because some of those needs far exceed the incremental benefit of having a little extra space for water quality treatment. And so I think there has been a little bit of that. I think there's also been we originally had some tiered buyer retention features planned that we were thinking about how we could divert some more of the localized street runoff into those at the top of the project. But upon realizing how poor condition the pipes were in, realized that the greater need for that space was to replace that pipe conveyance with a long-term stable conveyance that should provide some water quality benefit, but maybe not to the degree that something with more volume storage might provide. So we've also kind of been looking at trying to adapt our plan to help meet the needs of the landowner, and also, the fact that they've made an investment in the project and that came at the expense of other things for, residents such as gutters or what have you. And that those, replacement of those pipes or other things in the futures are real expenses that would come at a future cost to residents. So we're kind of able to adapt in that way and still have some water quality benefit. I think is a way that needs to be tackled in that way to be as much of a win-win as possible.
Tim has his hand up. You want to add something, Tim?
Yeah, I did. I figure before we wrap up, for those who don't know, Marshall was the project manager of this for the consultant team. And I figure it would be nice to maybe turn the camera on him for a minute and ask him what was the most satisfying and the most challenging aspects of managing such a complex project. So two-part, most satisfying and most challenging.
The most satisfying to me is definitely the fact that the implementation has come along at a fairly swift pace. Now, I'll tell you, there's parts of this, the plan had like 61 projects and then a bunch of policy initiatives. And yes, there's a certain frustration on my part that policy is often harder to influence than moving dirt is. Okay, so but clearly the most satisfying part has been the hard work that Renee and everybody has put into, getting these projects actually moving at this time. And, I'm excited that they'll have bids out in a month or so, and the Southside project will be getting under construction and everything else. The challenging part, urban restoration is challenging, right? And you generally go into a restoration project or watershed restoration project saying, well, we're going to reach this attainable goal of water quality or whatever. And frankly, I think we had to scale back to a goal of halting degradation and setting a path towards restoration, we hope, in the next decade. So really the plan says we need to spend $10 million just to halt degradation and perhaps get us on the path towards restoration. And I know, like many of you, I grew up playing in streams, and I told Renee when she first got us on board is, my dream for this is to have Kids in the Creek program in Haith or in Nasty Branch, without fear of harming the kids and everything, and all. So that's it, to make the community understand, respect, and cherish those streams. I know that's a big task, right? And I don't know how to get it done, but I hope, but I hope that this gets on the path. Audience, I'm gonna hush. Audience or panel, do you have questions you want to ask each other, or has everybody just burned to a frazzle?
I'd pause for Marshall.
Yeah. Organizing us, Marshall.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall.
Thanks for
Thank you
sticking with
all.
us.
Thank you.
Yeah.